Great. So thank you so much to Brenna Goodwin-McCabe for being here for the first talk of our weekend at the Final Girls Berlin Brain Binge. This workshop is called The Hills Are Alive, Singing and Screaming in Horror Musicals. Can't wait for this. I'm just going to introduce you to Brenna, and then I will give Brenna the floor. Brenna Goodwin-McCabe is a versatile Canadian writer and director with a keen interest in Gothic horror. She has presented writing at McGill, Dalhousie, and UBC, where she completed her grant-awarded Masters of English degree with a thesis on Frankenstein and Pan's Labyrinth. Brenna established Hearth Pictures by writing, directing, and executive producing the multi-Leo award-winning horror short I Can't Go On, which played at Final Girls Berlin in 2025. Recently, Brenna directed and wrote a Betty Boop-inspired horror musical short called Start the Show. Alongside filmmaking, Brenna publishes articles on critical film analysis through her blog, youremindmeoftheframe.ca. All right, Brenna, take it away, and we'll be back later with more questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Brenna Goodwin-McCabe. I'm very excited to be talking with you today about horror musicals. We're going to be getting into the gritty and the sing-song that is horror musicals and charting the history and the political consequences of that genre mixing. At any point, if you have a question, please give us a little alert. There will be a few moments for some discussion throughout the presentation, but primarily we'll have our Q&A at the very end. We do have quite a bit to talk through because there is quite a lot of examples of horror musicals, and obviously we won't be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we'll get to some big contenders. So I kind of wanted to start by discussing horror musicals in general, what everybody's awareness are of horror musicals. Are there any that anyone would want to share as far as like a certain horror musical that they really love before we get into some definitions? Is there anybody who wants to share? Otherwise, I will be sharing quite a bit about some of my favorites. Okay. I would say, as far as some of my favorites, I think it's a little bit of a giveaway that we're going to be discussing Phantom of the Opera adaptations. I really love Phantom of the Opera adaptations. I find them a really fascinating ground for adaptation and decade changes, a way of charting how a story is changing across history and why that might be. So, to get into a little bit of what a horror musical is, as well as some hellos and welcome, my main goal for today is that we're going to be charting and considering the consequences of a musical universe, discussing the history of the horror musical film in cinema, and specifically how and why such films are prime for political, social, and gender commentaries. Essentially, while they require a very strong stomach, either for those who don't like horror films or those who don't like musicals, such sing song murder routines offer fascinating insight into genre, expectation, and era. So we have essentially two different genres, the horror and the musical genre. Horror movie musicals suggest that the impulse to sing and scream are one and the same, both instinctive and loud. So while the musical genre is rather commonly known as something that is glitzy and glamorous, something with Julie Andrews, something that is reserved for kind of a Brigadoon 1960s era, even though there are many examples in contemporary culture, that is kind of the connotation of sort of a jazz hands, everything's happy. While the horror genre is usually a far more bloody endeavor, usually a far more desolate endeavor. Now, obviously, that is not entirely true on either front, but horror musicals, by their very union and existence, suggest that there is something strange about both genres. When you put them together, that strangeness becomes quite apparent. Essentially, the musical and the horror genres both ask the audience to suspend their belief that musicals can exist, that characters can suddenly start singing their utmost feelings and then immediately return to normal talking conversations, perhaps not even addressing the fact that everyone was singing and dancing moments before. Horror musicals, by comparison, ask you to suspend their belief. Suddenly, blood splatters can become far more obvious than would actually exist. A killer can have supernatural qualities. All of these things are asking you to suspend your belief for a certain amount of the film. And by comparing the two, they're essentially saying that they're operating through the same logic. One is involving exposure through a literal art form of singing, and the other is the art form of blood splatter, literal guts and bones. And by comparing the two, horror musicals are suggesting that the musical itself constitutes a form of possession, a sort of hive mind, where everyone is singing the same melodies, the same genre, the same story, and then immediately their choreography is done. They're independent beings when they are talking, but when they are singing, they are collective. So that is essentially what we're discussing as far as the horror musical genre. But what about the actual components of it, and why am I talking about it? Well, once again, my name is Brenna Goodwin-McCabe. I am a Canadian filmmaker and writer, and a lot of my work focuses on surreal and gothic as well as cosmic horror. My own background, I've just recently directed a musical short, a horror musical short, which was the first time I'd done such a thing, which gave me a little more experience on the actual practicality of applying some of these genre rules. In addition, I used to be a singer, which you can see at the bottom of your screen here. That was me about to perform Faust, the opera, specifically the Jewel song. Faust is a really interesting opera that we will be discussing at length through the Phantom of the Opera, which uses Faust as a sort of way of characters identifying themselves. In addition, as was mentioned in my wonderful introduction, I directed a short called I Can't Go On about a woman who discovers a body in her apartment elevator. And in each of these, I like to play with the constitutes of what is horror, what is an operatic motion and movement. In fact, in I Can't Go On, I did actually get to include a scene with Faust and the music of Faust as a way to suggest that the devil is already in the building that our action takes place in. So in each of these, I really enjoy finding ways to integrate music and the consequences of music into a horror environment. And then Paula Pop, who you can see at the top from my new short, Start the Show, is an integration of that actual horror musicality. So I wanted to give everybody a little sense of what we're going to be discussing and the order of. So we're going to start off talking about the self-aware musical. What is a musical if not drawing attention to itself? And in these cases, it's drawing attention to itself through the very characters that it's operating through. These are perhaps some of the most apparent, as in the musical constitutes are horrifying to the characters themselves. Their very existence is horrifying. So we'll start off by discussing that before getting into a few more of the constitutes of what is a horror musical and the different types of it. We'll follow into that, into our discussion on the horror musical history. Where did we start from the silent era to the talkies, and then get into the Phantom of the Opera case study, which essentially begins in 1925 and continues to the present day, forming a long-term conversation about the history of the horror musical. Eventually, we'll move into the idea of, does a horror musical need vocals? Can it be a dance? Can it be something else? And why are those distinctions apparent? And then continuing into our conclusion with a few other examples that we haven't had time to get into. Any questions so far before we get into a few more details? All right, let us continue. These musicals are out to kill us. Terrifying. Self-aware horror musicals, which essentially play with the idea that horror and musicals are together, and that combination is innately horrifying and a form of violence. So this image here is from a musical that is available online. Technically, it's not a film necessarily, but it is a filmed performance. So I'm considering it canon in this conversation. This is from the musical, The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, which is rather apparent. It is about a man who hates musicals, and the worst form of apocalypse happens where these zombie infection hits Earth, but instead of eating brains, it turns its victims into a musical hive mind, where they are performing, singing, and dancing while also trying to dismember people. And the main lead hates musicals, so this is his absolute worst nightmare. Now, The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals is a really interesting example of how can we draw attention to something being singing and dancing while also being horrifying. So while the subject of the song isn't necessarily always horrifying, the very fact that people are singing and dancing is terrifying. Which brings one of my favorite lines, and I think a line that a lot of this workshop is built around, and you can see it at the bottom of the screen here. You're right, I didn't think about the implications. This is a famous line that's played as a joke in the musical, where at one point the lead character approaches his love interest and essentially says, "These are the most horrifying creatures I've ever seen. I know it seems like a musical, but you have to think about the implications of a musical." And then eventually, after they're attacked, she comes back with, "You're right, I didn't think about the implications." The implications being giant hive mind enslaving everybody. This was not the first example that came to mind when it comes to self aware musicals, however. We do have Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And season 6, they have a very famous episode called Once More with Feeling, which is essentially about the dangers of musicals and dancing and singing through life. Now, I won't give too much context to this episode because I think it is a bit of a spoiler warning, although I would say that it's probably likely most of the people attending are rather familiar with this episode, or at least familiar with Buffy. It is a really incredible episode for quite a few reasons. Primarily, it really impacted pop culture. It sort of introduced this idea that every show should have a musical episode. We see this in shows like Community. Quite a few different examples appear following this episode, where suddenly, for whatever reason, perhaps the character is going through a psychosis, perhaps they are going into surgery, and so they imagine what's happening outside of their surgery state, but as musical. We begin to see that happen more in the 2000s, but that is all because of Buffy. It is also important to note that the episode is incredibly important as far as the events of the season. A lot of things are confessed, but I'll get to that in just a second. I think it's really interesting that the musicality in this episode really is relevant for the way that it frames anxiety and depression through musical theater. Because although it's poking fun at musicals, it's also using the genre to highlight uncomfortable issues that the characters wouldn't normally talk about, nor do they really want to. It is an unwilling exposure. And similar to The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, the episode suggests that musicals are inherently sinister and they do constitute a form of possession, where the characters are forced to sing against their will, and too much singing and dancing leads to a gruesome death where the characters literally combust, all thanks to the demon character that you can see at the bottom of the screen here in mid dance. This implies that dancing around issues in your life will eventually have disastrous results, and that bottling things up never works. As such, both the subject matter in these songs and the very format of the musical highlights the characters' conflicted emotional states. The act of singing represents a form of emotional transgression, where what was inside suddenly externalizes and has immediate consequences. If we're talking a horror film, transgression is usually a form of like a bone breaking, something inside popping out externally and being horrifying. Not specifically the thing itself, but the movement that something was inside and can come out. In this case, a musical would suggest that it is actually the lyrics, something that was inside you, the meaning coming out unwillingly, and that movement of in to out, or out to in, one of those, is innately horrifying. All right. Oh, that was not the right button. There we go. There's Abigail. Abigail is one of my favorite horror musicals, if we want to get into that term later when we discuss if a horror musical needs lyrics. But I think it provides a really good example here of what is a horror musical, as we go into an actual formal definition of it. As we have a little ballerina vampire covered in blood, but she's got her jazz hands up. She's doing a dance. She's got a smile. That is innately horror musical. There's a level of camp and irony that often comes along with it. And in that sense, horror musicals tend to focus on exaggerated subject matter, both musically and literally. They usually play with the expectations around a traditional horror film and a traditional musical film, while suggesting that the unions of these genres constitutes a form of monstrosity. Musical horror films thus imply that their very format and conventions are a perversion of their typical respective genres. It's sort of attempting to be challenging to those who really like horror films and those who really like musicals. It is intentionally jarring, but at the same time, that jarring can be quite entertaining. And I think it's interesting discussing it in the lens of a horror film because scores in a horror film are already a secondary character. Musicals are simply reorganizing this dynamic by actively involving their characters and environments. And by doing so, they often completely dismantle the diegetic and non diegetic boundary in a traditional horror film. So, through my own studies, I found that primarily we have two forms of horror musicals that emerge. We have the corny and we have the terrifying. These are the two forms of horror musicals. I'm going to give you a sec just to read through, and I'm going to read through as well. I'm just going to take a sip of water while we look. So, the corny. The corny is perhaps the more fun of the two types. It is essentially the actions of the characters belong in the horror realm. They are incredibly violent and disturbing, yet the songs are cheery. That creates a strong clash between the subject matter and either the song style or delivery. So, whether this is an original musical or a jukebox musical where all of the songs are covers of existing ones, these these happy melodies end up feeling warped and perverse because the context to where and how these songs are being delivered is bringing both new meaning to the lyrics, and it's also destroying something that perhaps you already have a certain fondness for, a certain melody that you grew up really enjoying, and now you will forever think of it in the context of this horrifying scene. I think it's also crucial to note there is a sense of humor to a lot of the corny horror musicals. It does mean because of that sense of humor, oftentimes it's rare to find an entirely corny horror musical. Usually it's used as like a one and done sort of example of like there is a scene in this movie where there is a sort of jarring juxtaposition between horror and a song. Because an entire film which relies on the needed kind of jarring effect of the two, that kind of runs thin on the joke. Obviously, there are examples, but more vital, we end up seeing it in things like Singing in the Rain scene of Clockwork Orange at the very top here, where the characters are torturing a couple, and while doing so, one of them, the lead, performs Singing in the Rain. What's interesting is Singing in the Rain ends up popping up quite a few times in horror musicals. It becomes a sort of a token. And I think that is partially because of Clockwork Orange and the infamy of that scene, where you can no longer listen to that song without thinking of that scene. Similar to Reservoir Dogs with the Stuck in the Middle with You torture scene, where we see a man have his ear cut off while the lead character is dancing around singing Stuck in the Middle with You. In both of those contexts, we have the meanings of those songs perverted. Specifically in Stuck in the Middle with You, we talk about the victim. Stuck in the middle is I'm stuck in the middle of you and this knife, and I'm not going to make it out in a way that I want. And it becomes kind of a joke for the lead character as he's singing it, as well as for the audience who is kind of listening to it in horror. So, what's interesting in all of these is that it's more popular with horror musical instances rather than an entire film. So, another example would be Beetlejuice, the Day O scene, where the characters are suddenly possessed by a Beetlejuice and sing the Harry Belafonte song Day O. That is not something that happens frequently in the film. We do have a later Harry Belafonte scene in Beetlejuice, but it's not to the same extent of possession and taking over everyone's bodies and performing the song. That's reserved for a specific moment. That is not entirely a horror musical film. So that brings us to the other category, the terrifying. These are songs that are as ominous and tense as their subject matter. So they can still have a sense of humor, but the humor is less centered on the clash between happy go lucky and violent, and instead on the dark subject matter itself. Most of the examples we're going to discuss today do fall into this category, sometimes to add a bit of credibility to their genre mixing. The essential belief is that more than one genre, horror, having a bit more of that than a musical, or at least a traditional musical, will be easier to draw fans in, specifically under the logic that it's easier to convince a fan of Saw to see the musical Saw than a fan of The Music Man to see the musical Saw. The perceived divide between musical theater fans and horror fans exists, and it does govern what we move forward with. What's rather interesting is that there is actually a Saw the Musical. You can see a picture of it here. It's an incredibly camp comedy that sort of brings a more of a queer eye to the story of Saw. and makes it a romance with still blood and guts. There are quite few stage musicals where they adapt a film and then end up including a blood splatter zone of the audience where people are encouraged to wear ponchos. I've not personally seen Saw the Musical, unfortunately, but I do think they have something like that where everyone sits with a poncho and gets drenched in blood at certain sequences while they're singing. So there is a level of humor still, but at the same time, the subject matter of these songs are still usually rather dark. So that brings me to the concept of intention versus accident. I think this is a conversation we get into a lot when it comes to horror films. Looking at horror films specifically, is a film a horror film because the director or the writer or the marketing says that it's a horror film? Or is it a horror film because you, as an audience member, have decided that it is frightening? And this comes up a lot when we talk about children's films. Is it something that is traumatizing and horror related because you, as a child, were traumatized, or because you were a child and traumatized, and then you returned to a certain scene and realize that there's something incredibly messed up about the context of that scene that even as an adult you're kind of taking a moment to look back at. And that goes for a lot of musical sequences in children's films, particularly Labyrinth here. For those unfamiliar with Labyrinth, it is a wonderful film with Jennifer Connelly and David Bowie, directed by Jim Henson. This sequence in particular features a song written by David Bowie. It's performed by these creatures, the Fireys, whose entire persona is taking off their own limbs and throwing them to one another. They're sort of a cluster of fur. And as they're singing, they sing a lot about like drinking and gambling and a lot of weird, if you pay attention to lyrics, they do sing kind of quick, so you kind of miss it. But there's a lot of weird things that David Bowie decided to put in this song for a children's film. And at the very end, they all crowd around Sarah, the lead, and try and dismember her because then she can join them. And they're very confused that her head doesn't just pop off. So they're really just trying to pull and sing along while she tries to escape. So looking at this as a child, you kind of perhaps think, oh, this is, oh, they're coming for her head. Oh no, that's terrible. Oh, well, she escaped. It's fine. As an adult, you listen to the lyrics and you listen to the idea that they actually just want to pull off her head and how bloody that would be, even in the context of a whimsical musical. So it is a kind of a strange juxtaposition. Is this a horror film in this moment because of those consequences, even though there isn't any literal blood and guts? What does that mean as far as children media go? Because there are quite a few horror musicals that are technically aimed towards children, even if they deal with darker subject matter. So it brings me to this idea, can a non horror film also technically be a horror musical? Can it be a movie like Nightmare Before Christmas or Corpse Bride? Both of these examples are dealing with technically darker subject matter, particularly Corpse Bride, which has a whole song about the death of its character and how tragic it is, sung by skeletons. And most of the context of the film are essentially assisting children to become more aware with the afterlife and the concept of dying. Which is a really interesting thing to kind of introduce to children. It's sort of like Sesame Street, but a step up. As far as like, let's talk about it, the next thing that Sesame Street maybe didn't address, which is what happens to you after you die in the context of claymation. So it also brings to mind the, if we're talking about what horror film, what defines a horror film, and specifically in the context of a musical, it also brings to mind of drama films. There's a lot of drama films that exist that include prolonged sequences of blood and gore, but they're not marketed as horror films because horror has certain connotations with its fans, within Hollywood, within marketing. So I think what really defines a horror film, and particularly a horror musical, in the context of this conversation, is how it's being treated within the film itself. Is the film reviling in this motion? Does it add a choreographed dance number to murder? Is it talking about something that is perhaps a bit taboo, but through a song and dance of some form? That would be a horror musical. Similar to a horror film itself, is the film having a bit of fun with that violence? Or is it playing in a prolonged fashion that is bringing a certain emotional context that is perhaps outside of what we would constitute a just drama? So those are kind of a few of the components I would love for us to pay attention to as we move forward. Are there any questions before we continue? There are a few conventions I'm going to get to, but I just want to check in and see if there's any questions that have come to mind. Okay. So one of the big genre conventions, I would say the number one, hence the fact I have number one written there, is self-aware casting. So what is self-aware casting? Self-aware casting, and this doesn't just happen in horror films or horror musicals, it happens throughout films, is when a film will cast an actor that was in an earlier film that is perhaps being drawn as a reference to essentially show perhaps some credibility of like, oh, it's a musical, but Freddy Krueger's here. So you know what kind of film this is going to be by him being here as a horror icon. And sometimes it can add to an ongoing conversation. This character actor was in this film, and by being in our film, he's bringing the conversation of that previous film into this one. That's a really interesting way to point out a horror musical, as oftentimes they are in conversation with one another, particularly Phantom of the Opera adaptations. But before we get into that, we are going to talk about where the horror musical began, which was music in the silent era, which is perhaps a bit strange to consider, seeing as these are silent films. But what's really interesting is that when the silence first emerged, music was being released to different theaters across the globe, and it was up to the theater itself to play the music that went along with the film. And that essentially meant that studios had absolutely no control over how their films were screened. They might get lucky and have somebody who performed it exactly as they intended. They might get somebody who was a bit drunk and missed a bunch of notes, or someone who wasn't very good at the piano and kind of left halfway through the show. Or perhaps they'd get some person who decided actually they knew what was better and they would improvise an entire orchestral movement for this film. And the studio would have no idea because they're not actually attending every screening. So there was an era of this unparalleled musical freedom where essentially anyone who was in control of the music was in control of the film. They could change the context of how that film was being viewed, and that made a huge difference to the audience members of each independent small town that was screening the film. And then, of course, came the jazz singer. The Jazz Singer was the first feature length talkie, and it was a musical. It essentially needed to show that not only could characters now talk, they could sing. It couldn't just be talking, it had to be full on musicals. And that changed Hollywood forever. Now, I will say, The Jazz Singer, not a film I would recommend. I think I recommend it in the fact that technically it was incredibly innovative. But it is an incredibly racist film. The main context of the story is that the main character decides to wear blackface in order to succeed as a singer. It is interesting to see the level of influence, though, because you can essentially tell from the earliest days of talkie cinema, one director would go and see the film, be influenced, and then continue that into his own work. You can see the levels of repetition and influence forming in other films that were coming from that era, and so forth. That level of inspiration coming from the earliest days of cinema is related to rhetoric that is inherently sexist, racist, and generally horrific in its own context of the story. So it's interesting the jazz singer has this kind of form of violence, both in the actions of its characters and in the consequences of what it did for Hollywood. Before the talkies emerged, we did have a level of freedom as far as what was okay for marketing, because essentially movies were an industry that had a lot less control, and the talkies did bring a level of control back. What is really quite interesting is now we are beginning to have a bit more of a conversation on that. Babylon, which you can see at the upper right there, from 2022, redoes a scene from Singing in the Rain to essentially poke fun at the idea of this being a comedy, of talking about the tragedy, what happened to these people's careers when the talkie came in. Because if you look at the context of the Singing in the Rain scene, which is at the very bottom there, this actress has a rather high pitched voice that doesn't match the way she's been perceived by the public. And in order to excuse that, they give her a fake voice. And in this scene, it's revealed that the voice behind her is actually singing. It's not her singing. She's not talented. And she is an antagonist in the film, but at the same time, that's a pretty horrific moment that destroys her entire life, that kind of gets overshadowed by the wit and comedy of the film. And Babylon really draws attention to how horrifying the talkies were, what they did to Hollywood, how they destroyed people's lives, but also created new ones, the different innovations, the ebb and flow of that. And because they certainly had more control over how a film was being seen, No one was playing music to it in the actual theater. There was a less live component. It was all under the control of the studio system. And that meant further control moved into the production scale as well. We had things like the Hays Code, where you would see a character like Betty Boop, for example, who in the 1930s was sort of a Depression era jazz icon, very heavily sexualized. And then the Hays Codes hit. And we later saw in her episodes she was wearing a far more conservative outfit. She had a job. She was not provocative to nearly the same degree. She was often paired with an older man named Grampy, and they would have adventures, and she was very much like a grandfather. So we do see a huge shift in subject matter as well as the actual people making films. We had in the very early days of cinema quite a few female directors globally, particularly Dorothy Arzner here, who is at the very top. She was, I say openly, because it was early Hollywood era, so she was openly gay. And that obviously, when the Hays Code came in and there was less opportunities, she for a very long time was not recognized in the Hollywood system as an icon and a legend. And it has taken quite a while for that to become far more knowledgeable. So that is essentially the backdrop of what the talkies did. But at the same time, the horror of the talkies brought so much innovation. We wouldn't have what we now call the horror musical without it. And that did lend to an interesting environment of non musicals inspiring later music and musicals inspiring horror. So at the top here, you can see a scene from the 1932 film Freaks, directed by Todd Browning, who later went on to make or previously made the Dracula with Bela Lugosi in 1931. Freaks was critically reviled, and a lot of people, it became very quickly a cult icon. I highly recommend checking it out. It is a really interesting film. But the Ramones later saw the film and turned it into one of their songs. Their song Pinhead takes a chorus from the Freaks and turns it into a conversation on their own music, feeling alienated by culture, feeling alienated by political spheres. And their Gabba Gabba Hey became a sort of a touchstone that fans would herald to. So, just as a non musical film is influencing music, we also see a musical influencing horror films. So, at the very bottom here, you can see a scene from Meet Me in St. Louis. Meet Me in St. Louis is perhaps the most prolific propaganda film that I've ever seen. It is essentially about there is no place like home, particularly St. Louis. And I think the most obvious example of that is the fact that its lead is played by Judy Garland of the Wizard of Oz fame. So this sequence in particular, it is from their Halloween sequence. It essentially charts an entire year of a family's life, and the Halloween sequence is incredibly strange. It doesn't really match the tempo of the other film. It really does some interesting things because of its interest on Tootie, who is the little girl holding the mask there. Tootie is an incredibly messed up character who often talks about burying her dolls alive and stabbing people and wanting to kill people. She's a very strange child in the context of this very like golden age musical with Judy Garland singing about being sad at Christmas. And there are rumors that the creator of Children of the Corn was largely inspired by Tootie's characterization when making Children of the Corn, particularly this Halloween scene where we see a group of children all gathering around for a bonfire, burning things, running amok in the town, forming this kind of cult phenomenon around one another that eventually became the influence for a film like Children of the Corn, focusing on another kind of cult of children. So we see the overlaps happening between musicals and non musicals, as well as non musical films and music itself. So this tradition has been around for a very long time. And then we get to the official first horror musical, which is The Horror of Beach Party from 1964. What is really interesting about this is it claims to be the first horror musical very publicly. You can see in the advertisement here, the first horror monster musical. Um, you could definitely make the argument this is not the first horror musical, but it is the first to title itself as a horror musical, which is really, really important here. This musical is a weird, horrifying, and fantastic film by its own trailer. That is something they advertise themselves as. And I think it's important to put this film in context of the other films that were emerging from this era, specifically the William Castle mode. If you're not familiar with William Castle, he was an American director who really operated through movies as an experience, not just entertainment. Something that would travel from the screen into your seat and actually touch you, reach the audience in a very personal way, often breaking the actual projector, having characters reach out and talk to the audience and warn them, oh no, it's coming for you now. You can see in the very top here that skeleton would actually fall from the ceiling in a sort of Phantom of the Opera sort of way of the chandelier. Skeleton would jump down and scare people. The Tingler, which is the best title I've heard in a very long time. That's starring Vincent Price, another William Castle film. And I'm unsure if it's all of the chairs in the theater. I think that would be far too ambitious. I think it's one chair, and if you sat in it, it would become like a 4D experience where it would move around with the film and you would be threatened just as the characters were. And then, when the screen screams, you'll scream too. Try saying that 5 times fast. William Castle is the one on the bottom here. The visitors today, shocking, come back tomorrow. He was quite the character and a huge icon. He's a very big influence for directors like John Waters, especially, because he was kind of the first to really make film a bit more like a carnival experience. He was sort of the Alfred Hitchcock of a certain type of film. Alfred Hitchcock also really relied on experience and the audience, but William Castle was far more of like a buzzer to the audience, actually physically touching the audience and telling them to be scared. So we saw this level of B movie that emerged around this time of like these bigger than life antagonists, which kind of makes sense given the first musical being a horror musical, or rather, a monster horror musical. You can see him at the very top here. I don't know if he's particularly frightening. I think those might be fingers poking from his mouth. His eyes, I think, are a little Muppet-like. He's kind of charming, really. So it is this kind of strange B movie where, it is essentially a beach party, but also there's a monster. So we have singing and also there's a monster. And we see all of these factors leading up to perhaps the most famous horror musical of all time. One I am almost certain everybody in this seminar has attended at least once, the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, it's arguably the best well known, most beloved of the horror musicals, and perhaps the most well studied. As a comedy, it technically falls into the kind of corny category of horror musicals, but not with every song. It really depends on the song. I think this first one with the lips for science fiction, we end up seeing some really interesting references to B movies. The entire song is essentially referencing either B movies or B movie actors and the actions of those films, really setting itself as, before it's even introduced its characters, as a film of that kind, announcing to the generation that grew up on those films who is watching this one now as a young adult or a teenager that this is something similar, but at the same time a little bit more perverse, a little bit more sexualized. I would say perhaps a lot more sexualized, really, but it's a really interesting film for so many reasons, and I find the B movie references that are being made in the beginning of this particularly noteworthy. It is still incredibly popular. We currently have it on Broadway in New York. And very much like the William Castle method, it relies on interacting with the screen in those screenings and having characters actually performed live in front with shadow casts. It's a very much of the film is present, it is a musical, and you are singing with it. You are a part of this experience. You are not just complicit in watching, you are a part and complicit in a far more direct way. And although I'm not really spending an insane amount of time on Rocky Horror as compared to some of the other examples, mainly because I think most of the people here are very familiar with Rocky Horror at this point, I will be returning to it in reference, particularly because it is very much a pre and post world of the Rocky musical. You can very much tell what is before Rocky and what is after Rocky because they are all modeling themselves in some form as a response to what that was and what it did for culture and how popular it became after it had been released, even a few years after, once it had become the cult phenomenon that we know it as today. So, and even here you can see an RKO radio picture. That is another reference to the certain films that it is incorporating into its legacy of poking fun at, of bringing into reference, of essentially certifying itself as, I know what's come before, here's what's coming now. That is a bit sexualized, I'm realizing that now, but that is kind of the Rocky Horror way. Any questions before we move into our Phantom of the Opera? Okay, the Phantom of the Opera. Phantom of the Opera, I am definitely biased. Very big fan of the different Phantom of the Opera adaptations, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Phantom of the Opera is based on somewhat true events, according to its author, Gaston Leroux, who you can see at the bottom there. It was initially published through a newspaper between 1909 and 1910. And I think it's interesting to consider him in the context of broader horror musicals that were emerging when the 1925 and later musicals were coming out. The Phantom is a human in a mask versus a B movie that often features larger than life, non human antagonists. But when you just give a man a mask and show him that as doing violence, as doing something horrifying, that becomes as troubling as those horror movie creatures thematically because it's involving the audience. The Phantom wears the mask because of us, the viewer. Our society has banished him, it's punishing him, and then it dares to be shocked by him. And because of that, horror stems from both his physical deformities and societal reactions to him. And Phantom of the Opera, there has been an adaptation almost every single decade from the earliest days of cinema. In fact, the 1925 film is not the first Phantom of the Opera adaptation. There is a film from 1916 that is now lost, and we have very little evidence of what it was other than the fact that it existed. But the 1925 was technically the second adaptation that we know of. What is interesting is that the Phantom author, as I mentioned, Gaston Leroux, really claimed, even to his deathbed, that these events did happen, which kind of adds to the mystery of the book. You can see here at the top, it is based on the Opera Populaire, the Palais Garnier at Paris. And the underground is actually flooded. You can go around in a boat, and I believe they even train firefighters today in it. It's all because of a design error, which kind of works with the Phantom's legend of him being involved in the making of the opera house and designing that specifically to create a lair for himself. Now, obviously, the literal events of the novel did not happen, but there are a few actual people that very clearly were inspiration behind the story. All of that is lending to its mystique as far as adaptations go. So the based on the reality is something that continues moving forward in the different adaptations. So I think it's interesting discussing adaptation because we often talk about now, why do we keep making a film over and over again? Why do we keep using this IP? Why do we need to tell this story again when it's already been told this many times? Why is it being told again? And I think there is the question around the Phantom of this need for a sequel. There was going to be a sequel to the 1925 film. Gaston Leroux was actually involved in it, but it ultimately fell through. And that was probably the first example of a sequel as far as Phantom of the Opera is concerned, but there are quite a few sequels that have tried and failed around Phantom of the Opera. The only successful, and I use the word successful a little loosely, is Andrew Lloyd Webber made a Love Never Dies musical, which is technically a sequel to his Phantom of the Opera stage musical, but was critically reviled, and he doesn't really talk about it as much as his other work for quite a few reasons. But regardless, the Phantom always returns, even if it's not in a sequel. No matter how many times he dies at the end of a project, he always returns in a very Freddy Krueger-like fashion, which is perhaps a little foreshadowing here. So, Phantom 25. Phantom 1925 is a truly remarkable film, and one of the reasons it is so infamous is that it belongs to the public domain. Um, that means that on YouTube, if you are to search it right now, you can end up finding versions of different scores where people have done their own version of the score, where anyone can record and upload the entire film and use it in their own context and projects however they like. That level of accessibility and freedom has really opened itself to further adaptations, even within the film itself. Originally, it was a silent film. It was re released in 1929 with what is now a lost score. Apparently, Lon Chaney hated that score so much that he rejected the proposal to become Dracula in Todd Browning's film, which ultimately went to Bela Lugosi. So you can see here that all of the Universal monster films are connected, both from the creators and the viewer, how they were seeing monsters, how they understood them, and how they became later films. Um, what's interesting, particularly about the silent era, is oftentimes you end up getting either characters that move their lips and then the title card emerges and it matches what they were saying somewhat, or you get characters who don't move their lips at all, move their eyes around, and then you get the title card. Which is kind of fun when it comes to Christine and Carlotta. Carlotta being the aging diva who is trying to be replaced by Christine. Carlotta moves her lips and it very clearly matches the Faust score. Christine, meanwhile, does not move her lips at any point while singing, which means that while Carlotta's performance matches, Christine's looks like the singing is coming from elsewhere, which visually we can read two ways. Either it's suggesting that Christine's voice is so effortless and supernatural that it's moving outside of her, or perhaps more intriguing, it's visualizing that her voice isn't her own. It doesn't belong to her, it belongs to the Phantom, which is a dynamic we continue to see throughout every adaptation. What's also apparent is the opera Faust, which I've already suggested a few times, but to give a little context, it's the story of a man who sells his soul to Mephistopheles in return for youth, vitality, and love. Ultimately, he falls in love with a woman named Marguerite, and she falls pregnant and is arrested. And as she is led to be executed, she arises to heaven while Faust is dragged to hell, and the two are forever separated. The characters of the Phantom of the Opera, both in the novel and in the later events of different adaptations, define themselves using this opera. The Phantom also often casts himself as Faust, as a tortured artist, as a tortured genius. But as the musical usually goes to show, he is in fact not a tortured genius, he is Mephistopheles himself. So, why are we using Phantom as a case study? Well, I think it's important to note that there would be no other Universal monster films without The Phantom of the Opera from 1925. There would be no Dracula, there would be no Frankenstein, nor really any other monster films that we now have, because the success of this film essentially financed all of the other Universal monster films. And it was a musical, even though it was silent. It was about music, the characters were singers, and the score became quite a crucial thing for its accessibility moving forward. So, at the core of horror cinema, deep in the basement, orchestrating its horror is essentially the Phantom. It also set the stage for how audiences should react to horror. The stories of audience members watching as Lon Chaney was unmasked became infamous and later inspired how certain films were marketed. Particularly, you can see here we have the Phantom unmasking. Here he is, Lon Chaney, and he's looking at the audience. He's not looking at Christine. He's looking at you. He's telling you to be frightened. He's literally telling you to scream in this moment. They even refused to release promo images because they wanted it to be a surprise for audiences. That sort of legacy continued when we see other films of that era, like Freaks from 1932, which apparently caused a woman to have a miscarriage in the middle of the theater. There is a level of this is so intense, you have to see it, that can have the backlash, but also have a long-standing appeal for other creators who see it as a child, move it into their own works, move it into their own ideas and monsters. Similar, we also have Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which is what the picture at the bottom here is. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm circling this man here with the cigarette. That might be my favorite photo because everyone else is screaming and he just kind of has this defeated look of like he's going for the matches. He's seen too much. He needs a moment. And that was Psycho. That was the promotion of it held on to the idea of you have to see it. We can't tell you anything about it. It's just too intense, which is very much the William Castle method as well. I think it's also important to note when we're talking about the Phantom of the Opera that the Phantom of the Opera emerged in a post World War One world. And that was, as you can see in this picture, there was an entire industry around masks, around masking emotions from people who had come back, from fighting and masking themselves of battle scars. They were literally everywhere because people had come home completely devastated in so many ways. And so the idea that this film in 1925 emerged and was poking at a bygone era of the 1890s to illustrate that something that we were seeing today has always existed, and something of that isolation has always existed. And that continues into later Phantom adaptations and the different horrors that each generation is dealing with. And I think you can really do an interesting job of charting the Phantom adaptation to what horror was happening politically at that era. So, accessibility is also vital to emphasize here. There would be no Phantom adaptations if the 1925 hadn't existed as a Halloween program of public domain, played on different networks for a very long time. That nature is crucial to its broader influence across horror, its continued influence, and I would argue that that accessibility is one of the core values of horror musicals in general. The ability to take two genres that seem diametrically opposed and rely on cultural expectation to create a commentary that both complicates those genres and the audience's entertainment of each. It essentially asks the audience to be more conscious of something that feels familiar, to question why it feels familiar and what that says about a society at large. And then we got a multitude of other Phantom adaptations. I will be perfectly honest, these ones do not particularly stand out as far as my own enjoyment. They're still well worth checking out. We have The Phantom from 1962, 1943, and technically I'm counting this one, The Vampire of the Opera, which is a Dracula sort of film mixed with Phantom of the Opera. It's also Italian, so I don't believe it's in English. It is just fully in Italian. The plots do kind of overlap with all of these. They do try to innovate the subject matter in ways that we continue to see. The 1943 Phantom pays for Christine's lessons and then he's scarred with acid. And the 1962 Phantom sacrifices himself to save Christine. Multitude of them kind of change the ending in ways that we end up seeing continue forth. And the idea that the Phantom is a tortured artist who has his music stolen, we see that moving forward. But essentially, in these films, the Phantom had become kind of stuck. The same sort of style, the same storylines, period piece, other than the Vampire the Opera, which not a huge amount of people saw at the time. But for the most part, he was stuck to a traditional opera house. And then came the 70s. Phantom of the Paradise. Phantom of the Paradise, probably one of my all time favorite films. It is a musical experience unlike any other, which is strange considering how often it is compared to other horror musicals, particularly the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So you can really see some very different stylings coming in. It is not a period piece. It is set in the era that it was made. So technically a period piece to us now, but not when it was created. It modernizes the story to emphasize that that story contains a very relevant conversation on ambition and gender that is extending beyond the opera houses of the 19th century. It's about real world horror, things existing in the world of the viewer, that, while amplified by style and horror, indirectly frame politics the same way that Leroux's novel was, by suggesting that it is based on true circumstances. So while the characters and events may be fictitious, there is an underlying truth to its discussion that Phantom of the Paradise picks up on. It also shows that moving forward with the Faust story as a kind of touchstone of cultural ambition. How can we understand ourselves using a story that is old, both Phantom of the Opera and the story of Faust, specifically to the 70s, rock and roll and opera, both loud and dramatic, but that's similar to the juxtaposition of horror and musical, loud, dramatic, coming together to form something new. And this is also in a time where people were not talking about some of the consequences and politics that Phantom of the Paradise really head on addresses. Things like the violence against musicians, particularly female musicians, casting couches, corrupt police. Even though these elements are shown through satire, there is a direct statement against corruption, sexism, and the exploitive music industry, where dastardly villains are no longer content in opera house basements. They're running the entire music industry and the poor souls within it. And then we, of course, have the Rocky Horror comparisons. And I do think there is a very big point to be made here of how many overlaps there are with Rocky Horror between Phantom of the Paradise, to a kind of bizarre degree where I think the creators were kind of playing along with one another. Phantom technically came out first as far as time wise, but the Rocky Horror Picture Show was already on stage. So it really is kind of a bit of a ebb and flow. But there are a ton of similarities. For instance, Phantom of the Paradise at the very top there, we have the character Beef. Versus Meatloaf, who is on the other corner here playing Eddie. There's also in both musicals, there's a song about Eddie and how tragically he dies. And perhaps the biggest reference we have here is the casting. Here we have our lead in Phantom of the Paradise, who went on to be in Shock Treatment, which is the Rocky Horror sequel. So we do have a level of self-awareness as far as the overlaps between these, in addition to some of the influences. Both of these films are making references to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, references to Frankenstein and resurrection scenes, electricity, bringing things to life. All of these are happening in both films, which is also interesting because Phantom of the Paradise is not as recognized and also was met with a lot of controversy. There is a very big controversy around the Swan Song Records, which is what initially was called for the main creator here of the Phantom of the Paradise, the kind of dastardly villain. He initially had a record called Swan Song, and eventually they were sued by one of the Led Zeppelin managers. I believe it was Led Zeppelin managers, because he felt they were making fun of the recent death by electrocution of one of his musicians. Because there is a character who is brutally electrified on stage. And the logo is very similar, and so they had to change it in post and do a very strange CGI move where you can see the kind of copy paste bird over top of the podium here. That had to be done throughout the film, and there are multiple scenes in the film where it is not fully completed because they forgot it was in a certain scene, so it's kind of added to the legend that is the film. And in both cases, it is arguing that the audience is unable to distinguish reality from theatricality by the end of Phantom of the Paradise, because both have become forms of entertainment, which makes its way into the actual legacy and the history of the film in a very interesting way. Phantom is a hard-hitting nihilistic satire of music and commodification, but it's also a cautionary tale about corruption and fame. And the stance is perhaps its strongest with Rocky Horror Picture Show, because Rocky Horror Picture Show, its main lesson kind of is don't dream it, believe it. But there's no happy ending to the Phantom of the Paradise. It's just a finale and ambiguity of whether the horrors perpetrated in that environment will continue beyond these characters. The film is drawing back a curtain to revealing the true face of musical production and to contemplate, to essentially ask the viewer what they just watched, why these issues cannot be tidied away. These themes and questions about our society are just as relevant now as well, which is why so many of them continue to appear in Phantom of the Opera adaptations, which is a really interesting horror, the chilling kind that is left to the audience, the kind replicated. The horror isn't the phantom, it's the system of abuse that banishes him to the opera house. It's the system of abuse that pits Carlotta and Christine against one another. It's ultimately the argument that there is no way to defeat this system as a single individual, and the individual is often asked to enter into a pact of violence and entertainment because ultimately those two things are the same. All right. Any major questions as we continue forth? No? Okay. This era also brought around quite a few horror musicals. We have Tommy, which kind of is a bit of a border piece as far as is it horror musical, is it a traditional musical. But similar, it is also a direct criticism of cult fanfare, and it was released as the same year as Rocky Horror Picture Show. And again, Shock Treatment, the Rocky Horror sequel, which is critical of spectacles and what became entertainment TV in a very kind of prophetic way, suggesting that modern culture has marketed human emotion and personality to the extent where individual is an economic persona, which I think perhaps we can see a little bit of today. And then we have the question, was opera just rock waiting to happen? This is essentially the legacy of Phantom of the Paradise, as far as rock operas, many of which continue to play with the phantom story of a tortured singer who is given a pact with the devil to become a success, goes on to regret it, is either forced to marry somebody or is forced to be a certain type of music versus what they really want to do. A lot of these films integrate very famous musicians. We have a reference to David Bowie at the top. That is in Rock and Rule from 1983. Which is essentially a realm where those who rock literally rule. And it's led by an anthropomorphic creature and psychedelic science, all under the terrifying pair of Mick Jagger lips that you can see at the top there. There are multiple very famous voices in this, including Debbie Harry, who plays one of the characters here of Blondie fame. And there's a slight disjoint because oftentimes the singers will not provide the voices. The talking voices is just the singing voice. So you end up seeing a very distinct difference between singing as if it is a sort of mystical power and talking, which is just normal, something anybody can do. We also have musicals like Rockula and Suck, which are following very similar messages around the game between music and capital success and selling your soul through vampiric powers and supernatural powers. The musicians in each of these are facing a choice of integrity or glory, and almost always choose glory only to regret it, and then they spend the rest of the film trying to restore their artistry to something that they once loved. So it does raise the question, how relevant is that conversation now? Is we've seen it in so many ways. So would you make a musical monolith by commandeering a story? Who would do that when a story should belong to everybody, as it does with these very distinct films, which are each kind of playing with one another? Who would do that? Here comes the Weber Show. So in 1986, Phantom of the Opera emerged on Broadway and became the quintessential Phantom of the Opera that everybody kind of pictures when they hear Phantom of the Opera. And Andrew Lloyd Webber, the creator of, has really pushed for that he is kind of the creator of the Phantom of the Opera. He doesn't really talk about the book very often. This has become the definitive Phantom of the Opera that exists. And it was very much a part of the rise of the spectacle era of Broadway, where musicals had falling chandeliers and cats ascending to heavens. Or perhaps it was just Andrew Lloyd Webber's world. But for the most part, we saw a level of musicality on stage that became far more intense, far more stylized, far more dramatic, not so much horror. Phantom really is a drama in this. It is a stage musical which paints Christine and the Phantom's romance as something quite tortured, and it sort of erases the book's ongoing criticism of the Phantom and his toxic obsession with Christine, and it also entirely removes Faust from the story by just focusing on Weber's original music. I would also say it's one of the least political adaptations because it doesn't really pair its commentary with Phantom of the Paradise. Um, I think that's perhaps because Andrew Lloyd Webber kind of comes off a bit as the swan character of that Phantom of the Paradise, who is the sort of Mephistopheles role. He's not really coming off great. Some of his behavior around Sarah Brightman, who played Sarah Christine here at the very top. And that does lead into what else was happening in this era of musicals, because we, at the very same year, had The Little Shop of Horrors, which is again returning to this conversation of the B movie, an antagonist that is larger than life coming for its characters. But what's interesting is it too is discussing about the dangers of capitalism and consumerism, and the way in which something that green, something that we hope for, which is one of the main songs in the film, becomes a sort of an antagonist in the end. Something that is capital, something that we hope for. That green meadow in suburbia becomes capitalism, money, this green monster that feeds off of America and the poor before moving into broader spheres. And I will say it is specifically against Americans. You can see that commentary very apparently here with the American flag at the back. Audrey 2 is feeding off of the poor before leveling neighborhoods, moving on while feeding off of the desire for capitalist exceptionalism of the individual from characters like Seymour, who really just want to make a difference to become more than what they were initially, which is similar to the Phantom of the Paradise of I have something to offer the world and it is worth whatever price other people pay. So we do see this level of spectacle approaching Broadway, but also approaching films, um, and the horror musical, which led to what is perhaps my favorite horror musical, Phantom of the Opera in 1989, starring Robert Englund of Freddy Krueger fame. This is very much the gory spectacle that we've been waiting for. It returns to Leroux's source material of The Phantom, and it returns it to the horror domain while additionally complicating and modernizing the novel's horrific subject, specifically the ability to mask. I really do think if we look at the taglines here, he's not just in your mind, he's not just in your dreams. This phantom can drag you back in time. The film really plays off the fact that Freddy Krueger is playing the Phantom, and it does restore a level of comedy to the piece that I think has been missing in quite a few Phantom of the Opera adaptations. And it really combines the three qualities I look for most in films. It's got time travel, it's got excessive violence, it's got opera. It has literally everything you could want in a film, and I found my copy at a dollar store. I really love this film, and I think everybody should walk away and watch this, but I think it's also really interesting for the way it restores horror and humor in equal measure as a sort of commentary on Weber's musical that had become so incredibly famous, even down to the makeup. Weber's musical relies on the fact that you as an audience member are seeing the makeup at a distance versus this one where Robert Englund, who sort of models himself as a sort of modern day Lon Chaney, really wants to show you in detail the makeup. We get quite close up as he adds layers of skin onto himself and his deformity to try and disguise it as he's sewing pieces and moaning while looking at Christine's picture. It is something incredibly detailed and visceral, which is what was missing from the stage musical, going up close and personal and showing what makes horror horror. So we have a lot of the 80s slasher final girl effects that comes into this, and that similar conversation on music and adaptation as a form of immortality, kind of the first that we'd seen of, because the Phantom has so many adaptations, he is immortal because his music and his personality and his romance is continuing across multiple films. So eventually we were able to move forward into the kind of more drama of the stripping back the spectacle of the 1990s. We had The Phantom of the Opera from 1990, starring Charles Dance, which is available on YouTube. I highly recommend it. It is quite wonderful, but it is not horror. It is very much returning the Phantom to a drama sphere, moving away from the hyper violence of the 1989. But at the same time, we have Phantom of the Megaplex, which is at cursory glance perhaps the most tame of all of the Phantom adaptations. It is a Disney TV movie, but it is also a rather political one. It inadvertently discusses the idea of a movie theater as a conglomerate and the deadly threat that that poses and the rise of the soulless corporate mega theater that we see today. So it does have quite a few layers going on as far as its commentary go. And of course, we have The Phantom of the Opera from 2004, which is returning to that spectacle of the Weber stage musical, and doesn't really do a lot as far as politics go, but it does kind of turn what was fairly operatic into far more of like a traditional musical theater. These characters are actors outside of Broadway, and we can see that in the vocal qualities of them, which is sort of trying to make it a bit more approachable. This isn't just musical theater, this is a traditional drama film. That same year, however, in 2004, we got Stage Fright with Minnie Driver and Meatloaf. Minnie Driver, who was also in Phantom of the Opera, the 2004 version. So we do have that conscious casting of look at who is here. They are making a commentary in our film. Excuse me. Hmm. Are there any questions as we continue forth as I take a sec? Okay. So Stage Fright is a really interesting musical about a camp for musical theater fans that is terrorized by this phantom character in his pursuit to stop all musicals and focus on heavy metal. So we do have quite a few references to Phantom of the Opera, but in addition, Rocky Horror with the presence of Meatloaf and the Phantom of the Opera of 2024, or rather 2004 with Minnie Driver. So all of these adaptations are focusing on spectacle whether or not they reject it or accept it. And we also see around this era the Sweeney Todd spectacle, the level of spectacle and bloodshed becoming intermixed in the early 2000s, something that was perhaps in its most extreme in the 1989 of Phantom of the Opera, but continuing forth here, where we do have Tim Burton's version of Stephen Sondheim's musical with excessive blood that is thrown literally all over the place as characters are brutally killed and turned into meat pies. It is perhaps the most bloody that we'd seen so far as like the consequences of eating people and things, and a actual broadly sent out and marketed musical. We do have cannibal musicals before this, but this is perhaps the most famous as far as budget goes, as far as lead actors and lead director. So these are all of our phantoms here, and I've included Swan from Phantom of the Paradise in addition, because although he doesn't start off masked, he ends up masked. So we can kind of see the comparison here between all the different forms of the phantoms, how they are being masked. We can see the mask kind of ebbing and flowing, essentially going from a little more restricted, a little more, oh, we can see the entire mouth. Nope, we're back down to all of it. Oh, we can see the mouth. Nope, we're back to masked. Which is, I think, interesting looking decade by decade. And I would love to do more time on that as well. Of spending, a detailed amount of essay of going through why is it that we see more of a certain feature versus less of in a certain context in a certain decade? What is that suggesting about the different connotations of that era? Because I think you can see even in this 1925 one where he has the gauze over his mouth, there is a really interesting juxtaposition between the removal of that for the 1943, something to suggest that his performance as a silent era, we can't see his lips. That is too deadly, too brought into his deformity. Versus here, where he could just be a regular person walking down the street. He even gives himself eyebrows that are styled to the era versus the kind of painted ones here. This is actually sculpted into the mask. And then later in 1962, that kind of backpedals on all of that, and the mask is kind of an extension of his banishment and the placement of him in the dark. And that brings me to The Future Is Now, Repo the Genetic Opera. This actress here is Sarah Brightman, who you would recognize from playing the original Christine Daae in Phantom of the Opera. So again, Repo the Genetic Opera, we are playing with who you know. It is very much a game of who you know. We have Anthony Head, the very dearly departed, who is playing the Repo Man, who is repossessing organs in a post-apocalypse musical future. And in this song, he's about to sing while stuffing his arm up a man to play him like a puppet, which is just, normal stuff that happens in a horror musical. Delightful. There are so many references in Reba the Genetic Opera to earlier musicals, and that is something that continues in the same creator's other works, the Devil's Carnival series. But with Repo, it's created with a conscious intention of being read as a cult film, and all the associations that that term elicits. The film is actively participating with the legacy of films like Rocky Horror Picture Show and other cult horror musicals like the Once More with Feeling from Buffy with Anthony Head and Sarah Brightman of Phantom of the Opera, and particularly using those fandoms and casting decisions to bring people into their movies and to bring comparisons to those characters of, Anthony Head here being a father, being somebody who is doing what he thinks is best for his daughter, which juxtaposes his role as Giles in Buffy. Sarah Brightman as the tortured artist who is eventually sacrificed for her art, which kind of makes her a bit of a Phantom and Christine role in the context of playing Blind Meg in this musical Repo the Genetic Opera. And that created another series of films called The Devil's Carnival by the same creator, some of the same casting as well. There were two films, The Devil's Carnival and The Devil's Carnival Alleluia. And in both, we have this sort of ongoing conversation of what is heaven, what is hell, what if the two are at war with one another. In Repo, we have characters that are governed by their genetics, and ultimately decide to resist those genetic codes to become their own people. And that sort of happens in these films of the Devil's Carnivals. They are repeating the same Aesop fables as morals for human behavior, as justification for why they belong in hell or heaven, until eventually the characters break from those systems and begin to reject the unfair moral system. So I would argue that essentially these films are doing the same. They are returning to earlier works, earlier actors, and associations of the cult film and making them their own. So while these films didn't create the conventions that they're using, they really expand the horror and opera genres because they're literally titling themselves Repo the Genetic Opera. while also directing their audiences to the broader politics around genetics, responsibility, and rebellion. You can see here at the bottom here, this is Ted Neely, who played Jesus Christ in Jesus Christ Superstar. I met Ted at a screening a few years ago, and he is absolutely amazing and was incredibly excited to be doing this film. It was something very different to what he was doing, and he was also a little nervous around his fandom of Jesus Christ Superstar, what they were going to think about him being in a musical about hell, even though he was an angel in the film. But they cast him for a very specific reason to bring him into the conversation of, look, this is heaven. We literally have Jesus here. And he's singing a song, one of the first musicals you've seen him in since Jesus Christ Superstar. So all of these are making references to other films to try and give a little certification, but also change some things. And I want to kind of end my presentation today by talking about, does a horror musical actually need vocals? Because we do have quite a lot of ballet films that integrate horror. And I think that these arguably still connect as horror musicals because ultimately they are talking about a form of amplification. They're talking about gender. They're talking about body horror. Ballet is absolutely horrifying when you look at what these dancers do to their bodies in order to create such art, and the level of ambition and exhaustion. All of those, I think, mirror what the conversations around Phantom of the Opera were doing, as well as the history of the ballet. There's definitely overlap in the Palace Garnier in Paris in France, which is where Phantom of the Opera takes place. Many of the characters are ballet dancers, and there is a level of overlap between opera and ballet that I think is quite prevalent in these films like Suspiria, Tales of Hoffmann, and Abigail, a personal favorite of mine, where ballet is a form of violence, is a form of possession, is a form of exhaustion, as well as the history of the fact that when ballet was present in the opera populaire, it was a form of prostitution where patrons were meeting the dancers. They had specific rooms designed in the actual opera house for such engagements. And there is a level of trauma and art that I think is innate to ballet, in addition to these horror films that are playing with the connotations as well as bringing some agency and freedom to the movement that is quite rigid, in very interesting ways. Suspiria especially has one of the more recognizable horror scores of all time. And I think one of the reasons it's so effective, where the constitution of people singing and dancing is something that is antagonistic as well as freeing. One of the films that I think does such an interesting job of this is Mulholland Drive with the Club Silencio scene. And I know there is a later presentation that I hope everyone here attends that is talking about David Lynch and evil Los Angeles. And I hope they get into this, but Club Silencio does such a really interesting job of playing around with the idea of music and film, the idea that you as a character have certain expectations over recording, and when that is removed, there is something innately horrifying. And in the sequence, we have a woman who is performing singing, and at the very beginning of her song, the maestro comes out to announce to the audience that everything you're about to see is an illusion. It's all fake. But we fully buy in as she performs this to the point where we're emotional, we're watching, and then she stops singing, and the music and the singing continues. And there is this strange, horrifying beat of singular horror, realizing that what we thought was happening wasn't. And I think that alone is really interesting as far as horror musicals, as far as what does it mean to pay attention to the self-aware horror musical? What does it mean to pay attention to the consequences of a horror musical? And the fact that everything you're watching is fake, is choreographed, it is not natural, but unto itself, there can still be meaning, there can still be heartbreak. And it's an interesting ongoing conversation. David Lynch does such a phenomenal job in discussing that, as I think many of his films technically constitute as musicals. Eraserhead as well. We have the In Heaven sequence, which again isn't necessarily a musical film, but the way in which the score is presenting itself as an antagonist plays into the genre conventions of the horror musical mixing. So, where do we go from here? Well, I want to end by directing everyone to a few other horror musicals that we didn't really have time to get to. As I mentioned, there are other cannibal musicals. This one from 1993. There's also the Hell of a Boss series, which is ongoing and for free on YouTube. There's The Ghastly Love of Johnny X, which, if you enjoy Phantom of the Paradise, highly recommend. Paul Williams is also in The Ghastly Love, Johnny X, drawing that conscious casting. Anna and the Apocalypse, also incredible. A very wonderful Christmas film about the apocalypse and singing and zombies and Christmas. So highly recommend adding it to the rotation. And in all of these, I think we are drawing attention to the fact that horror musicals are becoming more prevalent. We are seeing more examples as more people have that accessibility online of viewing films more easily, not just having them, occasionally in a theater when they saw when they were children, but being able to rewatch, to pause, to go back, to make their own. That's something I really had fun with in making my own horror musical short. And it's something that was highly, highly celebrated, as is rightfully so, in Sinners, that came out last year, which is a truly incredible film and a horror musical, a very clear horror musicals with vampires. And I think and I hope that horror musicals continue to move forward in that level of funding, in that level of attention and celebration. And from the earliest and latest in film traditions through the silent, the talkie, and new media, the horror musical has charmed and terrified its way across our cultural zeitgeist, presenting beautiful music where just underneath, similar to the Phantom's masked face, is a treasure of peeling skin and rotting flesh and absolute consequences of the most beautiful nature. So that is what I have for you today, as well as this final frame from the cabinet of Dr. Caligari influenced Phantom of the Paradise, where they are drawing some very clear visual examples while also singing a rock song from the 70s. So that has been my presentation. I'd love to get into some Q&A. I think we still have about 5 minutes, but happy to go into more detail. And I think we do have a handout that has some links that will be sent out as well at some point.
Thank you so much, Brenna. I'm seeing some applause emojis being sent upon the screen.
Thank
Um,
you.
I think, yeah, it was an extremely enjoyable and entertaining talk. So, yeah, big thanks for coming and presenting this super comprehensive research of this subgenre, which I think we can
Absolutely.
both agree has not been given enough attention.
Very true. Very true.
I mean, if anyone already has questions, I mean, you've had full retention, by the way. Like everyone who came has stuck
I'm glad.
around. They've
I'm
been
glad.
wrapped. Um,
Sometimes I do talk about these things quietly to myself in my room, so it's always good to have other people there, and then you're a little less crazy.
I mean, I'm always going to remember this distinction that you made between the corny and the terrifying when I'm when I'm thinking about the use of yeah, of music and film and this kind of like dismantling of the diegetic boundary. And yeah, there's so much rich stuff going on in this subgenre. I also really loved your talk about film as kind of like a carnival experience, spectacle experience, also going way back to the origins of music in silent cinema, and then coming towards William Castle and his gimmicks and so on. So there was really, yeah, it obviously has such a
Really
like
does.
complex lineage.
Yeah,
Um,
but like you say, it's all connected,
yeah,
honestly. I think that is the number one takeaway I have from studying horror musicals is it's all connected from the conscious casting to the influences. A lot of the time you see the same influences popping up from different films, like Frankenstein, it comes up quite a lot. Singing in the Rain comes up, that gets used quite a few times in horror musicals. It's always interesting to see the touchstones people have when it comes to certain stories. Alice in Wonderland, that's another one that gets integrated quite a bit. But it becomes you have sort of like a source text that a lot of musicals will need to reference in some form or another.
absolutely.
Mhm.
I have kind of like a niche question about like the
Yeah.
mask. Yeah, like the Phantom's mask. How do you feel about the spectacle versus mask? Um, like
Yeah.
this as kind of like a dichotomy that's being messed with in this genre. Like what's being revealed, what's being concealed, and like than what's being shoved in your face. I don't know. This was just kind of a thought that started
Yeah,
floating
I
around when you did this
100%.
close study of the mask. So, yeah.
Yeah, honestly, I would love to do an entire lecture just talking about phantom masks, because I think they're really, really fascinating as far as like cultural indicators. Obviously, I think I've mentioned my bias of phantom.
The connection's a little bit off. Is it breaking up for you too, Ellie?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. Are you still there, Brenna? We might be having supernatural forces interfering with our signal. I mean, in the meantime, while we're waiting for the signal to stabilize, does anyone else have any thoughts or comments that they want to add to the chat, or even,
Hi,
Hi,
Brenna.
sorry
Okay.
about that. Sorry, please continue your point. I can also go into what I was saying there, but if you were finishing, please.
I think we missed most of what you said,
Response.
unfortunately.
Oh, not a problem. I can repeat on that. I think
Please.
um the 1989 Phantom, who's played by Robert Englund, his mask isn't a traditional mask. He doesn't really wear a traditional mask except for like there's a literal mask ball that he wears one where it's just a skeleton face. But otherwise, he does just sew pieces of skin from his victims onto his face to cover up. And as we move into the present, because it is a time travel movie, he is able to find like a synthetic way. So he fully looks completely atypical, normal. He wanders.
Wonder what's happening. Yeah, we're getting.
I was muted. Maybe we have to end there if nobody has any pressing questions from the chat. Or Ellie,
I
do you
do
have a
have a question, but I'm wondering if Brenna can maybe come back, like log on again quickly, if that's possible. Brenna, if you can hear me.
Or if it could be possible, Ellie, if you ask your question, Brenna could type it in the chat and then one of us can read it as the answer, just to have a little bit more interaction before we log
Yeah,
off.
I'm not sure if Brenna can hear us right now. Brenna, can you
Brenna,
confirm if can you chat?
okay, she is logging off and
Okay.
hopefully logging back on,
Okay.
so we can do a few minutes
Sorry,
of
people. The magic of
conversation.
Zoom.
Yeah, it's kind of like a seance, as I've heard joked before. It's like, can you hear us? Okay, so
Brenna,
you've come back, Brenna.
could you hear us this whole time? You're on mute now.
Oh, it's definitely a seance. Yes, I'm here with you now. Let's see if I can stay. I heard a little bit, but please remind me.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering. I have one question for you. Just I was thinking also of your title, and wondering about the difference for you between like screaming and belting songs. Like if you have more thoughts on that, and also where hysteria comes into play with this. Um,
100%. Yeah. I can also share as a singer. I'm not somebody who can belt, and I've always been very envious of it, but it is kind of screaming. It never sounds nice when you are doing it. And I think that was one of my earliest examples of like, this is a really weird thing to be doing, and we're all sounding off key inside of our heads, but when we perform, it sounds pretty, it sounds powerful, it sounds all of this, but it sounds like screaming when you're actually doing it. It hurts to do it. It actually strains you. You can damage yourself very easily in doing it inside of you in a very personal way that no one else would necessarily know. So I do think that when it comes to singing and screaming, there's so much overlap between and now I am singing. It is something instinctive that happens in a musical of I am reacting to heartbreak. This is how I respond. This is my way of screaming in a way that is still entertaining to the audience. And that is something that is quite messed up, I think, if you're looking at, this is for your entertainment and my sorrow versus a horror film where we have somebody who is screaming as an instinct. There's somebody who jumps out, they scream. It's the same way of instinct, but it's for a very different audience, a different form of entertainment. You know, the amount of times you'll see somebody scream for and joke in a movie about it. You know, you're like, oh, that also got me. Oh, that was funny. You're not in danger, but that person is. There's a level of complicity that I think is really interesting to play around with horror musicals when they begin to draw attention to you as a viewer. What is your involvement? What is your responsibility in watching somebody get dismembered, in watching somebody sing a song about something and feel heartbreaking while you're like, oh, this is such a great song. Oh, she's doing a great job. This is so good. There is a level of kind of heartlessness that I think horror musicals really draw attention to in the very combination of those two. That was something with my own short where we were playing with Betty Boop and the enemy is the camera, playing along with the idea that anything can come alive in a Betty Boop cartoon, whether it is an item, it can become a friend or a foe. And so I was really interested in the camera becoming a friend or a foe, which for me was my way of kind of reconciling this, of like the audience is involved, it is a form of violence, it is a foe to the characters that it is studying. And that I think is at a lot of the core of horror films and horror musical films specifically.
Have you done any research into like fan cultures around these musicals?
Yeah. Interesting fandoms, for sure. Rocky Horror obviously is perhaps the most popular. Also, a lot of people have said that it can be both an amazing thing, it can be a form of community for small towns, especially people coming to grips with who they are, coming to grips with their sexuality, their gender. All of that has been so incredibly helpful for so many. At the same time, I've heard lots of these fandoms, as is with any fandom, can be incredibly toxic too. Like both of these things can exist. A level of obsession can exist. That I think is true for Rape of the Genetic Opera, where there is a sort of cult like phenomenon that can happen of following the musical, of going to live screenings, of following the cast around. It can be an interesting comparison of like, you as an actor are on my screen, and therefore I have a connection with you because I felt something while watching you, even though you didn't know I was watching. And musicals can be taken a little step further of like, I was singing with you, we sang together, you just don't know it. We were doing the same moves. I was replicating what you were doing in a far more intrinsic way than just, I was recreating a scene with a friend. No, no, I'm recreating the literal dance you did in the literal costume while singing the songs and saying the words that you said in a similar context. It's a very like intense version of replication.
That's super interesting from thinking about like this trajectory from like capitalist critique and like also critique of like individualism towards something more collective, towards then something
Yeah.
potentially cult-like.
Yeah, and I think Phantom of the Paradise is perhaps the most apparent of that, of like, it doesn't know the difference between entertainment and violence. It doesn't, those two are exactly the same. So when you have a character dismembered on stage, even though it's a doll, they're all excited. They're like, oh, this is exactly what we want. And then they have a character literally electrocuted. And the kind of studio head realizes that this is what the audience wants. They want to see violence. They want to see something so intense that they can belong to, that they can destroy and consume, which takes on a kind of Orpheus trait of, the story of Orpheus, the famous Greek musician and myth, who, loses Eurydice and becomes completely devastated. And his music is so heartbreaking that he's literally torn to pieces and devoured by the followers of Bacchus. And only his head survives, and it is immortal, and it can read out prophecies. And I think that alone kind of comes into the horror musical of like, you are dismembered, and that is what is needed. We must consume the sorrow that you hold and consume the talent that you have, and it will destroy you if you do not escape. And that becomes, I think, a very continuing narrative that pops up. Phantom of the Opera being, perhaps the most literal example with Christine of like, you have talent, but if you follow this path, it will also destroy you. In order to become great, you must destroy yourself and who you are now. And that becomes a individual based, individual focus. I must become who I am, and the artistry must be its own entity. That I think a lot of these kind of play around with, whether or not they land with agreeing with that or disagreeing. Far more likely disagreeing.
Any comments from the audience? Any films that you would have liked to see discussed?
Yeah, please. I'd love to add to my collection. Honestly, I have so many. I love to just selfishly add to any musicals I should be checking out.
When you were talking about the terrifying versus the corny, I kept thinking about like really old-timey children's songs that are typically used in like extremely violent scenes in horror films.
Yeah,
It'll just be like a
fully.
record skipping over a nursery
Yeah,
rhyme or something like that.
yeah.
Um,
I really love in the Ready or Not series, they actually decided to make a song that sounded like an old song, like the Run 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 hide and seek song. It's not a real song before the film. They made it sound like traditional early 30s, early 40s of like the song sounds fun. Everyone seems to be having a good time, but you pay attention to lyrics, you're like, "Huh, this is okay, a little messed up." Goes well in a horror film, I guess for a reason.
yeah, it's interesting the things that music can do to us and the places it can bring us in our past and
Yeah.
yeah, fantastical
Music
realms.
music has a a really interesting quality of connection of like I think it's a form of meditation when you breathe in and you breathe out, and it's similar to people who are like sometimes you just got to scream, it's sometimes get it out, get the anxiety out. Some people find very much the outlet of that, of like I can't scream but I can perform Singing in the Rain, and that will kind of help alleviate and calm me down, and the breathing and the focus of that, which is what I try and do versus screaming. It's so far so good. We'll see how we do.
Yeah, there's so much more we could
Um,
go into. It's
Yeah,
this.
there's so much in there in this really dense and really interesting talk. Thank you, and workshop.
Yeah.
Um, I do think we probably have to get going, so to speak, because we have another talk right after this, Alex Hall's lesbian settler horror. So hopefully everyone can join us. Yes. And Sarah, is there anything else you would like to say before we? Brenna, thank you so much again. Yeah, this is wonderful.
Thank you both. I had such a great time. I'm really glad that we got to talk today. I hope everyone enjoyed. I have my contact information on Instagram. You can come find me. Please follow me, Brenna Goodwin 1. We'll be posting updates about my new short film and all sorts of fun things. And I think we also have a worksheet I've put together with lots
Yes.
of different links for different things that were discussed, as well as a few other things I recommend. So feel free to check it out and go be horrified and enjoy.
Are we sending that worksheet to everyone who registered, or just if you request it?
If you request it, yes, please. And also post it on our stories. Yes.
Cool.
Brilliant.
And we hope we see more films from you in the future. We really enjoyed the one that we screened last year.
Well, absolutely be in touch. Yeah. Well, and such an amazing opportunity today. Thank you both so much. And thank you, everybody.
Thank
This
you.
has been really lovely.
Yeah, thank you so
Great.
much.
Bye.
Really
All
enjoyed it.
right.